Ada Marrow was given the East 40 because no one else wanted it. 6 years of thin soil and thinner rain had left the parcel cracked like old leather, and the town of Harrow's Bend had long since stopped counting it as farmland at all. When her father died and the estate was split among 4 cousins, the good bottomland went to the men who could shout loudest at the meeting, and the East 40, rock-veined, sun-blasted, bordered by a dry wash that hadn't run water in 3 seasons, went to the quiet woman who didn't argue. She took it without complaint. That alone should have told them something. By the 3rd week of April, word had spread that Ada intended to plant her entire spring crop using a method no one in the county had seen. Unglazed clay jars, sealed at the neck, buried up to their shoulders between the rows, filled by hand, and left to weep water slowly into the roots below. She called it seep watering. Her grandmother, Raina Marrow, had spoken of it once, decades before, in a voice thick with an accent from a country nobody in Harrow's Bend could place, and had never lived long enough to teach it properly. Silas Duff, who farmed the good land just north of the wash and served without asking on every committee the town had, laughed loud enough that 3 dogs started barking. "She's gonna water her turnips with teapots," he said, and the phrase followed Ada through the dry goods store for a month afterward. On the 2nd Saturday of May, in front of 11 witnesses including the town's water commissioner, Ada staged a demonstration. She had dug 40 jars into 2 rows of new bean shoots, packed them with the wrong clay, river clay, too fine, fired too hot, sealed too tight at the shoulder where it should have stayed porous, and when she poured the first bucket in, the pressure cracked 6 jars in a chain reaction that sent muddy water sheeting across the demonstration rows and into the public footpath. The beans meant to prove her method drowned within the hour. Commissioner Aldous Pratt, unamused at the mud on his boots, issued her a formal notice the following Monday. The county would not renew her contract to supply the dry goods store with produce that season, citing unproven and hazardous agricultural practice on shared boundary land. It was the only income Ada had outside the farm. Silas Duff told anyone who'd listened that he'd warned them. She walked home past the wash that evening with mud still dried in the creases of her knuckles, and she did not cry, because crying had never once made a jar hold water. It took her 3 days to open her grandmother's chest again. The notebook was where it always was, wrapped in oilcloth beneath a folded shawl that still smelled faintly of wood smoke. Raina Marrow's handwriting slanted hard to the left, half in English and half in a language Ada had never learned to read, but the sketches needed no translation. Jars with wide bellies and narrow, unglazed necks, buried so only the collar showed above the soil, water added not by the bucket load but by the cupful, twice a day, never once flooding the shoulder seam. In the margin, in English, her grandmother had written a single line that Ada had skimmed past 100 times without understanding it. The clay must breathe, or it drowns the field trying to save it. She had used the wrong clay. She had used too much water, too fast, sealed too tight. She had built something that looked like her grandmother's design without understanding what made it work. The middle of that summer was the quietest Ada had ever lived. She stopped going into town except to trade what little she could spare. She dug her 2nd set of jars alone, behind the barn where the road couldn't see her, working the local clay herself. A coarser red clay from the creek bank 2 miles east, underfired on purpose, left porous enough to weep instead of pour. 12 jars this time. No audience. Her husband Eli helped her haul the clay in the wagon, but said little. He had married a woman people were beginning to call strange, and the silence between them at supper had grown a new kind of weight. It was Eli who broke first, not Ada. Late in June, with the contract gone and the county assessor's letter about back taxes sitting unopened on the table for 4 days, he stood in the doorway of the barn with the mule buck already harnessed and told her he'd found paying work with his brother's freight outfit 2 counties over, and that maybe it was time they let the East 40 go back to whoever wanted it. Ada did not argue with him either. She only asked him to wait 1 week before he answered his brother. She did not spend that week talking. She spent it working. Every evening, she brought Eli's supper out to where he sat mending harness leather by the barn, and every evening she left a single ripe bean pod, grown from the 12 quiet jars, resting beside his plate without a word of explanation. By the 4th pod, he had stopped mentioning his brother's offer. By the 6th, he was digging jars beside her before sunrise, saying nothing about it. the way a man says nothing about a decision he's already made. The 12 jars held. Through a June that saw less than half an inch of rain, the seep-watered rows stayed green while the rest of the East 40 browned at the edges. Ada logged it all in her own hand, in the back pages of her grandmother's book, alongside the old sketches. Jar 4, filled 2 cups morning, 2 cups evening, soil moist to 2 inches at 6 p.m. Jar 9 cracked at the base, replaced, cause. Buried too shallow, sun on the shoulder. Numbers piled up the way faith rarely could. 41 plants sustained on 11 gallons of water across 9 days, compared to the 200 gallons the flooded rows up the road drank and lost to evaporation by noon. Only one person in Harrow's Bend ever came looking for those numbers. Widow Pruitt, whose late husband had dug the very wash that now ran dry, walked the mile and a half out to the East 40 in the last week of June, leaning on a hickory cane, and stood at the fence line studying the 2 rows of green in a field gone the color of wheat toast. She said nothing for a long while. Then she asked, in the flat voice of a woman who had buried more than one husband and outlasted most opinions, how many jars it would take to do her own quarter-acre kitchen garden. Ada told her. Widow Pruitt nodded once, said she'd be back with her own clay, and was true to her word. By the second week of July, the sky over Harrow's Bend had turned the color of an old bruise and stayed that way without breaking. The creek that fed the town well dropped 4 inches in a single week. Cattle bawled at troughs gone to cracked mud. The county paper, printed 40 miles off in the county seat, ran a single line about drought conditions unmatched since the settling of the territory, and nobody in Harrow's Bend needed the paper to tell them what their own wells already had. Silas Duff's North Fields, watered the old way, by ditch and by flood, by a man who trusted brute quantity over patience, began to die in the second week of the heat. He did not come to Ada. Pride does not walk itself a mile and a half down a dusty road to knock on the door of the woman it laughed at. He instead spent 3 days trying to deepen his own well by hand, working through the worst heat of the afternoon with his shirt off and his face gone the color of a scalded kettle. And on the 4th day, his youngest daughter Prue, 7 years old and fetching water for the men, wandered too near the collapsing edge of that half-dug well and went in with it. It was Widow Pruitt's boy who came running for Ada, because the widow's own legs weren't fast enough anymore, and because everyone in that stretch of the county now knew where the water was. Ada arrived to find 11 men standing at the mouth of a well shaft with no clear plan, shouting the girl's name into a darkness that only shouted back dust. Silas Duff stood at the edge with rope burned raw across both palms, 3 failed attempts already behind him, his face gone the color of ash instead of scald. For one long moment, seeing him like that, seeing the wreck he had made of his own field and his own, well, trying to outmuscle a drought instead of outthinking it, Ada felt something close her throat. The old hurt of the cracked jars, the mud on the commissioner's boots, the 6 months of being the woman with the teapots. Her hand actually reached for the coil of rope Eli held out, and then stopped, hovering, a full 3 seconds of nothing, while somewhere below them a child cried out that she couldn't feel her foot. It was the sound of that voice, not any resolve of her own, that moved her hand the rest of the way. She did not tie the rope the way the men had. She had spent a summer learning that force poured too fast only cracked what needed to hold, and a well shaft cut in a hurry through dry, unstable soil was no different from a jar sealed too tight. It wanted patience, not muscle. She had Eli lower a wide sling of harness leather instead of a noose of rope, weighted at the bottom with a seep jar packed with wet clay to keep it from swinging, and she went down herself, feet braced wide against the crumbling walls the way she'd learned to brace herself over unfired clay so it wouldn't collapse under its own weight. 14 feet down, in air gone thick and cool, she found Prue Duff wedged against a shelf of packed earth, one ankle twisted but the rest of her whole, sobbing too hard to climb. Ada wrapped the girl into the sling against her own chest, called up in a voice she kept level on purpose, and let the men haul them both toward the light a foot at a time, slow as watering a jar, so the walls wouldn't come down around them on the way up. When they broke the surface, Silas Duff was on his knees before either of them had fully cleared the lip of the well. He did not say the word sorry. Men like Silas Duff rarely learn that word in time to use it. But he took his daughter from Ada's arms with both burned hands shaking, and as he did, he looked at Ada Merrow, mud-streaked, clay under every fingernail. The woman he'd told a whole store full of neighbors was watering turnips with teapots, and he said nothing at all, which from Silas Duff was as close to an apology as the county had ever heard. There was no crowd waiting to celebrate at the Marrow farm that evening, no parade of neighbors come to admit their error, no second meeting called to overturn Commissioner Pratt's notice. The commissioner did, 3 weeks later, quietly renew what he had quietly revoked, and Widow Pruitt's kitchen garden fed 2 families through the worst of that August, and eventually other jars appeared half-buried in other fields around Harrow's Bend, dug by farmers too proud to ask Ada directly, but not too proud to copy what worked. None of that came that first night. That first night, Ada Marrow sat alone on the back step of her own barn with a lantern turned low, and Eli came and sat beside her without a word, the way he'd learned to. She had her grandmother's notebook open on her knee, and beneath the last entry, jar count, 41 holding, 4 replaced, 0 lost this week. She wrote one final line for the season, small, in a hand steadier than it had been in June. The field did not need less doubt. It needed the doubt to move the hand anyway. Somewhere past the fence line, the mule buck stamped once in the dark and went quiet, the way he always did once he decided a thing was settled. The dog Scout, who had spent the whole terrible afternoon pacing the well's mouth and refusing every command to sit, finally lay down across Ada's feet and did not get up again until morning. She did not think, that night, about Silas Duff's face at the top of the well, or the commissioner's boots, or the whole long county's worth of laughter that had followed her from May to July. She thought instead of her grandmother's hand slanting hard across a page in a language half lost to her, and of 12 quiet jars dug behind a barn where no one was watching, and of how the field had never once cared whether anyone believed in it, only whether she kept coming back to fill the jars, cup by cup, long after the crowd had gone home to laugh about something else. A field, she had learned, does not forgive a flood, but it will always, eventually, answer patience.